Sometimes the quietest person in the room understands the most, the old maitre d' liked to say. But on that autumn evening in Manhattan, no one in Whitmore House believed that sentence was about a waitress. The dining room glowed under warm chandeliers, the kind that made crystal glasses sparkle like tiny stars above linen tables that cost more than most people's rent. Outside, Fifth Avenue hummed with late evening traffic, yellow cabs sliding past the tall windows like restless fireflies. Inside, the restaurant was calm, elegant, predictable, until Margaret Whitmore tried to speak. She sat near the center table beside her son, Daniel Whitmore, a man whose name appeared regularly on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. At 42, Daniel had built a billion-dollar investment empire that stretched from New York to Silicon Valley, and the room seemed to tilt slightly whenever he entered. Waiters straightened their jackets. Managers appeared from nowhere. Investors leaned closer, hoping to catch his attention. But tonight, Daniel wasn't watching the room. He was watching his mother. Margaret Whitmore lifted her hand gently, trying to signal the server standing a few feet away. The young man smiled politely, nodded, and walked off without understanding a single thing she had tried to say. It happened again a minute later. Another server approached the table, offered a courteous smile, then left with the same confusion in his eyes. Margaret lowered her hand slowly. For a moment, she looked down at the white tablecloth, smoothing the edge of her napkin as if it needed perfect alignment. Daniel noticed the movement immediately. His jaw tightened just slightly. It wasn't anger yet, but it was close. Margaret had been deaf for most of Daniel's life, ever since an illness took her hearing when he was a child growing up in Connecticut. She had learned to read lips, learned patience, learned how to navigate a world that moved too fast for silence. But crowded restaurants were different. People spoke quickly. They looked away. And sometimes, like tonight, they simply didn't know how to help. Daniel leaned back in his chair, glancing around the room. For a moment the power in his gaze returned, the quiet authority that had negotiated billion-dollar deals across glass conference tables. A manager noticed immediately and started walking toward them. But before the man reached the table, something unexpected happened. From the far side of the dining room, a young waitress stepped forward. She moved quietly, almost cautiously, as if she didn't want to interrupt anything important. Her name tag read Emily Carter. Most of the guests in the restaurant had not noticed her once that evening. She was simply part of the background, another server carrying plates between tables. 25 years old. Honey blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Calm blue eyes that seemed to observe everything without drawing attention. She stopped beside Margaret Whitmore and gently placed the coffee pot on the table. Then, without speaking a single word, Emily lifted her hands. Her fingers moved in smooth, graceful shapes through the air. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore. How may I help you tonight?" For 3 full seconds, no one at the table moved. Margaret Whitmore blinked once, then twice. And then her entire face lit up with the kind of smile Daniel had not seen in a very long time. Margaret Whitmore's hands lifted instantly, responding in the same graceful language that had just appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a Manhattan dining room. Her fingers moved quickly, almost eagerly, the way someone speaks when they suddenly realize they no longer need to struggle to be understood. Emily Carter followed each motion with calm precision, her expression warm but composed, translating thought into gesture without hesitation. "Good evening," Margaret sighed. "I was trying to ask if the soup contains dairy." Emily nodded gently and replied in the same silent rhythm, "No dairy in the vegetable soup tonight, but the lobster bisque does contain cream. I can recommend the roasted tomato soup instead." Margaret laughed softly, a silent laugh that still managed to fill the space between them with warmth. Around them, several nearby diners had begun to notice the unusual exchange. At first it looked like a quiet conversation between a waitress and an elderly woman, but within seconds people realized they were watching something far less ordinary. Plates paused halfway to mouths. Conversation slowed. A man at the next table leaned slightly forward in his chair. Meanwhile, Daniel Whitmore had not moved at all. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Emily's hands as they moved through the air with effortless fluency. Daniel knew sign language. Not enough to speak it comfortably, but enough to recognize when someone truly understood it. And Emily Carter did not just understand it. She spoke it the way a musician plays a familiar piano piece, without looking at the keys. Margaret continued signing, asking about the bread, the tea selection, even the dessert menu. Emily responded instantly every time, explaining each option with small, careful gestures and a patient smile. The conversation flowed for nearly a minute before Daniel finally spoke. His voice was calm, but carried the quiet authority that had built a financial empire. "Where did you learn to sign like that?" Emily lowered her hands slowly and turned toward him. For a brief moment, the two studied each other. Daniel Whitmore was accustomed to people reacting to him in predictable ways. Some became nervous. Some became eager to impress him. But Emily Carter did neither. She simply met his eyes with polite composure, the way a professional server acknowledges a guest. "I learned from family, sir," she said gently. Daniel tilted his head slightly, studying her more carefully now. Something about her answer sounded simple. Too simple. Yet the way she had just communicated with his mother had been anything but ordinary. Margaret touched Daniel's sleeve and signed something quickly. Daniel washed her hands, then glanced back at Emily. "My mother says you are the first person in this restaurant tonight who actually spoke with her instead of guessing what she wanted." Emily smiled, but it was a quiet smile that carried no pride. "Everyone deserves to be understood," she said softly. Margaret signed again, this time more slowly, her expression thoughtful. Emily responded, and the older woman laughed once more, shaking her head in amused disbelief. Daniel had seen his mother dine in hundreds of restaurants across the country, from Boston to Los Angeles. She was always patient, always kind, but rarely this relaxed. For the first time that evening, Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his curiosity fully awake. Across the dining room, the restaurant manager had also noticed the scene unfolding. He stood near the entrance watching Emily Carter speak with the Whitmore family, clearly wondering how one of his quietest waitresses had suddenly become the center of attention in the most exclusive dining room on Fifth Avenue. The manager remained near the entrance, watching carefully as Emily Carter continued speaking with Margaret Whitmore in calm, precise gestures. In a restaurant where every detail was controlled, every movement rehearsed, this moment felt strangely unscripted. Emily was not rushing. She was not nervous. She simply communicated with Margaret as if this quiet language belonged naturally in the middle of a crowded dining room. Margaret signed another question, this time about the dessert menu. Emily responded with a thoughtful expression, explaining each option with small, elegant movements of her hands. "The lemon tart is very popular tonight," she signed, "but the chocolate soufflé takes about 15 minutes to prepare." Margaret nodded enthusiastically and signed back something that made Emily laugh softly. Daniel watched the exchange with growing curiosity. His mother rarely joked with strangers. But here she was, clearly enjoying the conversation. "What did she say?" Daniel asked. Emily turned toward him again. "She said the chocolate soufflé is worth waiting 15 minutes if it tastes as good as it smells." Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "That sounds like her." Margaret noticed the smile immediately and signed something else quickly. Emily translated again. "She says you should try the dessert too, instead of pretending you are too busy to enjoy dinner." Daniel shook his head slightly, amused despite himself. "That also sounds like her." Margaret tapped the table gently to get Emily's attention and signed another sentence. This one slower and more thoughtful. Emily watched carefully, then nodded before answering. "She says this is the first time in a long time that someone at a restaurant has spoken with her without looking confused." Daniel glanced around the dining room again. Several nearby tables were still watching, though now they tried to pretend they were not. Waiters moved quietly between tables, but even they seemed curious. It was rare for the Whitmore family to become the center of attention for something that had nothing to do with business or money. Daniel returned his gaze to Emily. "You said you learned this from family." Emily hesitated for only a second before answering. "My younger brother is deaf." Daniel did not speak immediately. The answer explained part of it, but not everything. Many people knew a few signs because of family members. But Emily's fluency was something different. Her movements carried rhythm, confidence, and a level of understanding that came from years of conversation, not occasional practice. Margaret signed again, asking a question that made Emily pause briefly before responding. Emily's hands moved slowly this time, explaining something with careful detail. Margaret listened closely, her eyes following every motion. Daniel noticed the change in Emily's expression. There was a softness there now, something personal. "What did she ask?" Daniel said quietly. Emily lowered her hands and met his eyes again. She asked how long I have been signing. Daniel waited. Emily answered calmly. Almost my whole life. Margaret nodded, clearly satisfied. But Daniel could see that the conversation had only made his curiosity stronger. Across the dining room, the manager finally stepped closer, pretending to check another table while stealing a quick glance at Emily Carter. In all his years running the restaurant, he had never seen a quiet waitress transform the atmosphere of the room so completely just by speaking a language that no one else had noticed before. Emily Carter stepped back half a step from the table, giving Margaret Whitmore a moment to study the dessert menu that had just been placed in front of her. The older woman traced the printed lines with quiet concentration, then looked up again with the same gentle curiosity that had appeared the moment Emily first spoke to her in sign language. In a dining room filled with polished silverware and quiet conversations about markets and mergers, the two women seemed to exist in their own calm pocket of silence. Margaret lifted her hands again. Emily watched closely and translated the movement almost instantly. She is asking if you grew up signing, Daniel said softly. Emily nodded. Yes, almost from the beginning. My brother lost his hearing when he was 2 years old. Our house became very quiet after that, at least for people who depended on sound. But for us it became a house full of hands moving in the air. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. She signed another sentence slowly, her fingers careful but steady. Emily answered with the same calm rhythm. Daniel noticed the change in his mother's posture. She was sitting straighter now, more present, the way she had looked years ago when he was a child, and the world still felt easier for her to navigate. What did she ask this time? Daniel said. Emily glanced toward Margaret before replying. She asked if it was difficult for your brother growing up. Daniel expected a simple answer. Instead, Emily paused briefly, as if choosing her words with care. It was difficult sometimes, she said, but he taught all of us something important. Daniel waited again. Emily continued, her voice quiet but steady. When you grow up with someone who cannot hear the world, you start to notice things other people ignore. You watch faces more carefully. You pay attention to small movements. Silence becomes another kind of conversation. Margaret Whitmore listened closely as Emily translated her own words back into sign language. When Emily finished, Margaret smiled slowly and touched her hand over her heart in appreciation. Daniel watched that small gesture and felt something shift in the room. The restaurant still looked the same. The chandeliers still glowed above white linen tables. Glasses still clinked softly in distant corners. But the tension he had noticed earlier was gone. In its place was something calmer, almost reflective. Margaret signed another question, this time more playfully. Emily laughed softly before translating. She says you must have been the best interpreter your brother ever had. Emily shook her head with a small smile. Not at first. When we were kids I signed too fast, and he used to complain that my hands were as confusing as the television captions. Margaret laughed again, the sound silent but unmistakable in her bright expression. Daniel leaned slightly forward, resting his elbows on the edge of the table. For the first time that evening, he studied Emily Carter the way he studied people during negotiations. Calm posture. Careful eyes. Words chosen with quiet confidence. None of it matched the simple description of a waitress that the manager had given earlier. Emily noticed his gaze, but did not seem uncomfortable. Instead, she waited politely, as if she knew a question was coming. Daniel Whitmore rarely asked questions without purpose. And now he was beginning to suspect that the quiet young woman standing beside their table carried a story far more interesting than anyone in this restaurant had realized. Daniel Whitmore studied Emily Carter for another quiet moment while the soft sounds of the restaurant continued around them. The clink of silverware, the murmur of distant conversations, and the low hum of the city outside the tall windows created a familiar background that Daniel usually ignored. But tonight his attention remained entirely on the young waitress standing beside his table. Something about her calm confidence did not match the role she seemed to occupy. Most people became slightly nervous when speaking with him, especially in a setting like this. Emily Carter did not. She simply stood there with patient composure, waiting as if she understood that Daniel Whitmore was the type of man who took his time before asking the question he truly wanted answered. Margaret Whitmore lifted her hands again, curious as ever. She signed a short sentence toward Emily. Emily watched carefully and smiled before translating. She wants to know what your brother does now. Emily answered with another quiet laugh. He is studying engineering in Boston. Mechanical engineering. He says machines are easier to understand than people. Margaret smiled with obvious approval and signed something longer this time. Emily nodded while watching the movements carefully, then translated for Daniel as well. She says that is a very wise observation. Daniel allowed himself another small smile, but his curiosity had not faded. In fact, it had grown stronger. A waitress who could interpret sign language at this level. A family story that sounded thoughtful and sincere. And a calm presence that seemed more suited to a lecture hall than a dining room floor. Daniel leaned slightly forward in his chair. Emily, he said quietly. Yes, sir. Your signing is exceptional. That level of fluency usually comes from professional training. Emily tilted her head just slightly. I did take classes for a while. Daniel noticed the wording immediately. For a while? Not finished. Not completed. For a man who had built his career by recognizing details others ignored, the phrase stood out like a loose thread in a carefully woven suit. Classes where? Daniel asked. Emily answered without hesitation. Columbia University. The words landed softly on the table, but Daniel felt their weight immediately. Columbia was not a place someone attended casually. Margaret's eyes widened slightly with interest as Emily translated the same sentence for her in sign language. Margaret signed something quickly in response. Emily smiled again. She says that explains why you signed so clearly. Daniel folded his hands together on the table, his curiosity now fully awake. If you studied at Columbia University, he said slowly, why are you working here? The question was not cruel. It was simply direct. Emily did not appear offended. She paused for a brief moment before answering. Sometimes life takes a different path than the one you planned. Margaret Whitmore watched the exchange carefully. Even without hearing Daniel's voice, she could read the change in his posture. Emily translated the question into sign language for her, then translated Margaret's response back again. Margaret says that sometimes the unexpected paths teach us the most important lessons. Emily nodded thoughtfully. That is what my brother says too. Daniel Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair again, studying the young woman standing beside his table. The evening had started as a routine dinner in a quiet Manhattan restaurant. But somehow, in the span of a few minutes, a waitress named Emily Carter had turned the conversation into something far more interesting than any business meeting he had attended all week. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for a moment after Emily Carter spoke. The dining room continued moving around them with its usual rhythm, waiters gliding between tables, quiet laughter rising from distant corners, the muted glow of city lights reflecting against tall windows. Yet at their table time seemed to slow slightly, as if the conversation had quietly stepped outside the normal pace of the evening. Emily stood patiently beside the table, holding the small leather order book against her apron, her posture relaxed but attentive. She did not rush to fill the silence. People who had grown up communicating through sign language understood the value of quiet pauses. Margaret Whitmore lifted her hands again and signed another question toward Emily, her expression curious but gentle. Emily watched closely, then smiled before translating aloud. She is asking what you studied at Columbia University. Daniel glanced toward Emily again, waiting. Linguistics, Emily said calmly. American Sign Language Interpretation and Communication Studies. Margaret's face brightened with immediate recognition. She signed quickly, clearly pleased by the answer. Emily translated again. She says that explains everything. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. Linguistics. Sign Language Interpretation. Columbia University. None of those details matched the simple explanation of a waitress working the evening shift in a Manhattan restaurant. He studied Emily more carefully now, the way he studied market reports and investment proposals. You said you studied there, Daniel said slowly. That sounds like a degree program. Emily nodded gently. It was. Margaret signed another sentence while watching Emily closely. Emily translated again, her voice calm. She asked if you graduated. For the first time since the conversation began, Emily hesitated slightly. It was a very small pause, the kind most people would not notice. But Daniel Whitmore had built an entire career by noticing. Small things. No, Emily said quietly. I did not finish. Margaret's hand slowed as she signed another question, her curiosity now mixed with concern. Emily watched carefully before responding both in voice and sign. I left during my final year. Daniel waited again. He did not interrupt. People revealed more when they were allowed to continue speaking in their own time. Emily looked toward Margaret first as she signed the explanation. My brother needed surgery when he was 18. A specialized procedure in Boston. Our family insurance did not cover most of it. Margaret's expression softened instantly with understanding. Emily continued, her voice steady. I took time away from school to help my family manage the medical costs. Daniel felt the room quiet again, though the restaurant around them had not actually changed. For a moment, he pictured the tuition costs of Columbia University, the price of medical care in the United States, and the complicated choices families sometimes faced between opportunity and responsibility. Margaret signed another sentence slowly, her eyes warm. Emily translated softly. She says your brother is lucky to have a sister like you. Emily shook her head slightly. He would say the same thing about me. Daniel looked at Emily again, but his expression had changed. Earlier he had been curious. Now there was something else behind his gaze. Respect. Not the polite respect that wealthy clients received in places like this, but the quiet recognition that someone had made a difficult decision for the sake of another person. Margaret Whitmore rested her hands on the table for a moment, then lifted them again with a small, thoughtful smile. Emily watched closely as the older woman signed one final sentence, slower than before. Emily translated the words with a gentle tone. She says sometimes the strongest voices are the ones that choose silence so someone else can be heard. Margaret Whitmore lowered her hand slowly after Emily finished translating her words, and for a few seconds the three of them simply sat in a quiet understanding that did not need sound to exist. Around them the restaurant continued its gentle rhythm. Glasses touched softly against polished tables. Waiters moved with careful steps, and the distant hum of New York City drifted faintly through the tall windows. But at this table something subtle had shifted. Daniel Whitmore looked at Emily Carter again, and the way he looked at her was no longer the casual curiosity of a customer speaking to a server. It was the thoughtful attention of someone reassessing what he thought he understood about the person in front of him. Emily remained composed, though she could sense the weight of the moment. People sometimes assumed silence meant absence, but in truth silence often carried the most meaning. Margaret suddenly lifted her hands again with renewed energy, signing something longer this time, her movements animated and warm. Emily watched closely and began to smile before she even finished reading the sentence. Daniel noticed immediately. What did she say? Emily translated, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. She says if you studied sign language interpretation, you must have spent a lot of time helping strangers understand each other. Emily nodded gently. That was the best part of studying it. Margaret tilted her head curiously and signed another quick question. Emily laughed softly again before translating. She wants to know if you miss it. For the first time since the conversation began, Emily took a slightly deeper breath before answering. Yes, she said quietly. I do. Margaret listened carefully as Emily repeated the answer through sign language. The older woman studied Emily's hands for a moment, then signed another sentence slowly, deliberately. Emily's expression softened as she translated the message aloud. She says the world always needs people who help others understand one another. Daniel watched the exchange thoughtfully. In his world, communication was currency. Negotiations, presentations, conference calls across time zones. Billions of dollars moved every year because people understood each other clearly or failed to do so. Yet the quiet skill Emily had demonstrated tonight seemed far more meaningful than any boardroom discussion he had attended recently. Daniel spoke again, his tone calm but deliberate. Emily, if you were so close to finishing your degree, have you ever thought about returning to school? Emily looked slightly surprised by the question but answered honestly. Of course I have thought about it. Margaret signed another sentence quickly, clearly intrigued by the conversation. Emily translated again. She is asking why you have not gone back yet. Emily hesitated only briefly. Tuition is expensive, she said simply. Even part-time programs can cost more than most people expect. Daniel understood the truth of that statement immediately. Columbia University tuition alone could easily exceed $60,000 per year, not including housing or books. For many families, that number represented an impossible decision. Margaret listened carefully as Emily translated the conversation for her through sign language. The older woman remained thoughtful for a moment, then suddenly smiled again and signed something that made Emily pause in mild surprise. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What did she say this time? Emily looked at Margaret again before answering. She says you should not let talent sit quietly when it could be helping people. Daniel Whitmore did not respond immediately, but in that moment a new idea had already begun forming in his mind. Daniel Whitmore did not speak immediately after Emily finished translating Margaret's words. The idea forming in his mind was not impulsive. Daniel had built his career on careful decisions, the kind that began quietly and only revealed their full impact later. Across the table, Margaret Whitmore watched her son closely. Even without hearing his voice, she understood his expressions better than anyone. She had watched that same thoughtful silence during his first business negotiations when he was barely 25 years old. She recognized it again now. Emily Carter remained beside the table, unaware that the simple conversation she had started had shifted the evening in a direction no one in the restaurant had expected. She glanced briefly toward the kitchen where another server had just delivered a tray of desserts to a nearby table. Her shift was still in progress, yet she remained present, translating Margaret's next question as the older woman lifted her hands again with gentle curiosity. Margaret signed slowly, her eyes bright with interest. Emily watched, and then translated softly for Daniel as well. She is asking what you plan to do next. Daniel looked at his mother, then back at Emily. For a moment the sounds of the restaurant faded into the background again. I think, Daniel said calmly, that the world has already shown us what Emily should be doing. Emily blinked slightly in surprise, unsure what he meant. Margaret signed another question quickly, clearly intrigued. Emily translated again. She wants to know what you mean. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the edge of the table. His voice remained steady, the same calm tone that had convinced investors to trust him with billions of dollars. My mother spent years in rooms where people spoke around her instead of with her. Hospitals, offices, conferences. Most of them had the resources to provide interpreters, but did not think about it. Margaret watched him carefully, her expression thoughtful as Emily translated his words through sign language. Daniel continued. Tonight a waitress noticed what an entire room of professionals overlooked. Emily felt a faint warmth rise in her face, but remained silent. Daniel's eyes met hers again. Emily, have you ever considered working as a professional interpreter again? Emily answered honestly. I have thought about it many times. Margaret signed another sentence slowly, as if weighing each word carefully. Emily watched closely before translating. She says the world needs more people who understand silence. Daniel nodded once. Exactly. He paused briefly, then reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed a simple business card on the table between them. The card carried the understated design of Whitmore Foundation, the philanthropic arm of Daniel's company that funded educational programs across the country. Emily looked down at the card but did not touch it yet. Daniel spoke again, his tone still calm. The Whitmore Foundation funds several accessibility initiatives for hospitals and universities. We sponsor interpreters, training programs, and scholarships. Margaret's eyes widened slightly as she understood where the conversation was going. Emily looked from the card back to Daniel, clearly surprised. Daniel continued speaking in the same measured way he approached every major decision. If you still want to finish your degree at Columbia University, the foundation can make that possible. The words settled gently into the quiet space between them. For a moment, Emily did not move. Around them, the restaurant continued exactly as it had all evening, unaware that a conversation spoken partly in silence had just changed the direction of someone's future. Emily Carter stared at the small business card resting on the white linen table as if it had appeared from another world. The elegant black lettering of the Whitmore Foundation looked simple, almost ordinary, yet the meaning behind it felt enormous. Around them, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm without noticing anything unusual. A waiter passed carrying a tray of coffee cups. A quiet conversation drifted from a nearby table. Outside the tall windows of the dining room, Fifth Avenue traffic rolled steadily through the Manhattan night. But for Emily, everything seemed to pause. Daniel Whitmore watched her reaction with the same calm patience he used during important negotiations. He had made the offer sincerely, but he also understood that moments like this required space. Margaret Whitmore lifted her hands again, curiosity glowing in her eyes as she looked between the two of them. Emily noticed immediately and gently translated Daniel's words into sign language. When Margaret understood what had just been offered, her expression softened with unmistakable warmth. She signed something slowly, her movements graceful and thoughtful. Emily read the sentence and could not stop the small smile that appeared on her face. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. What did she say? Emily looked back at him, her voice quiet but steady. She says that sometimes the world whispers opportunities instead of shouting them. Daniel nodded once, appreciating the wisdom in the sentence. Margaret continued signing, adding another line that made Emily pause for a second before translating again. She says that kindness is also a language, and tonight you both spoke it. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, allowing a small smile to appear. For a man known across financial circles as disciplined and calculating, the moment felt unexpectedly simple. Emily finally reached forward and picked up the card, holding it carefully between her fingers as if weighing its meaning. I do not know what to say, she admitted softly. Daniel responded with quiet honesty. You do not have to say anything tonight. Opportunities are not contracts. They are invitations. Emily nodded slowly. The words made sense. She looked down at the card again and imagined the unfinished lecture halls at Columbia University, the sign language classes she had once loved, the quiet pride on her younger brother's face when she helped interpret a complicated conversation. Margaret Whitmore watched Emily thoughtfully, then lifted her hands one final time. Emily focused on the movement carefully before translating the last sentence aloud. She says that sometimes the smallest conversations change the direction of an entire life. Daniel glanced around the dining room again. The chandeliers still glowed softly above the tables. The same music played quietly through hidden speakers. Nothing about the room looked different. Yet something meaningful had happened here without anyone else realizing it. Emily slipped the card gently into the small pocket of her apron. Then she looked back at Margaret and Daniel with a calm, grateful smile. Thank you for dinner tonight, she said softly. Margaret signed a quick reply that made Emily laugh again before translating. She says you are always welcome at our table, even if you are not serving the food next time. Daniel Whitmore stood slowly from his chair, offering a respectful nod that carried more sincerity than any formal handshake. Emily Carter returned to her work a few minutes later, moving quietly between tables once again, but the silence she carried now felt different. Because sometimes the quietest language in the room is simply the moment when someone finally feels seen.